Welcome to the Brains on Brains podcast, brought to you by ECNP, where early career scientists speak with the most interesting experts in applied and translational neuroscience.
Hello, my name is Stefan Jerotic. I am a psychiatrist and researcher from the University Clinic of Psychiatry in Belgrade, Serbia. I have the pleasure today of being the interviewer for this podcast on behalf of the ECNP Early Career Academy. Today, we're joined by Dr. Awais Aftab, a psychiatrist and the clinical associate professor of psychiatry at Case Western Reserve University, known for bridging clinical practice with philosophy of mind and the conceptual foundations of our field. He edits the widely read newsletter Psychiatry at the Margins and leads sustained conversations that test the assumptions behind diagnosis, evidence, and treatment. He's also the author of the 2024 book published by Oxford University Press, Conversations in Critical Psychiatry. His scholarly work ranges from explanatory pluralism in psychopharmacology, epistemic justice in clinical care, to conceptual education in psychiatry, and he has written influential viewpoints for the New York Times. In 2025, the Lancet Psychiatry profiled him as one of the discipline's foremost public intellectuals. Dr. Aftab also serves as a senior editor at Philosophy, Psychiatry, and Psychology, the journal, and on the executive council of the Association for the Advancement of Philosophy and Psychiatry. A clinician and educator and incisive interviewer himself, he brings a rare combination of clinical realism and conceptual rigor. So, hello, Dr. Aftab. To begin
Thank
with,
you, Stefan.
can you tell us a bit how did your interest in conceptual foundations of psychiatry emerge?
Again, I want to emphasize that. Thank you so much for having me for this ECNP podcast. Pleasure to be here. With regards to my interest in conceptual aspects of psychiatry and philosophical aspects of psychiatry, it goes pretty way back. I even before medical school, I was very interested in philosophy, and there was a point when I was even considering going into philosophy professionally. But just kind of the way it turned out, I ended up in medical school, and so I was attuned to conceptual and philosophical aspects of medicine from the very beginning. And as my interest in psychiatry evolved, I started paying more attention to that. I started reading some of the kind of the classic anti-psychiatry literature, R.D. Laing, Divided Self, for example. And I was also quite interested in existential psychotherapy, illustrated by the psychiatrist and therapist Irvin Yalom. So these were some of my early influences in terms of thinking conceptually about psychiatry. And as my psychiatric training progressed, I became more formally involved through Association for the Advancement of Philosophy and Psychiatry, and I started, I discovered this burgeoning academic field and the excellent academic work that has been done since the 90s in this area.
And were there any particular thinkers or researchers who influenced your approach?
Yes. So Derek Bolton, who is at King's College London in the UK, he's a brilliant psychologist and philosopher, and he wrote a book. This was 2007, 2008. What is mental disorder? This was published through Oxford University Press, and I've revisited this book multiple times over the course of my career. And the first time I read it was just around the time I was starting my psychiatry residency. And I was really influenced by that because it was an examination of the question of what kind of judgments are we making when we say that a behavior is disordered, or that that a behavior constitutes a mental disorder. And it was the examination of the question of, to what extent is this a factual judgment, a naturalistic or objectivist, approach, or to what extent this is something that is very value laden, to what extent this is something normative, and how can we understand this tension. And reading that book kind of, I think, one, it set me on a kind of philosophical kind of path through my psychiatry residency as well, but it also guided me in thinking better about these questions. So Derek Bolton's What is Mental Disorder, a huge influence. The other big influence, I would say, is Peter Zackar's 2014 book, A Metaphysics of Psychopathology. And Peter Zakkar is also a psychologist and a philosopher based in the UK. And his work is focused on taking a pragmatic approach to metaphysical questions in philosophy of psychiatry and understanding questions of classification and diagnosis through the lens of pragmatic philosophy. And instead of thinking of diagnosis as natural kinds, thinking of them more as practical kinds, as categories that serve various kinds of clinical and practical and scientific goals that we set for them. So those are two big influences I would mention here. Kenneth Kendler is another one, kind of very famous, distinguished psychiatrist, geneticist, and his papers on psychiatric pluralism and thinking about psychiatry through a philosophical lens have also been very influential.
Since there are many ways that mental disorders can be conceptualized, as you were kind of, uh, uh, as you were talking about. So, what do you think about this biopsychosocial model, which is propagated as the foremost model for understanding mental disorders?
Yeah, so I think depending on the specific question we are interested in, there will be different kinds of models and different kinds of philosophical positions at play. The question of the biopsychosocial model refers in particular to issue of multi-level causality and the issue of how is it that different risk factors and causal factors at multiple levels of explanation, how do they interact with each other. And biopsychosocial model, which originated with the physician George Engel and his seminal work in the 1970s and in the 80s, has been conventionally a way of referring to and talking about this issue of multi-level causality in the psychiatric context. There are significant differences between how George Engel conceptualized the biopsychosocial model and how it is understood. So I think that historical context also matter. But generally speaking, what a lot of people mean when they talk about biopsychosocial model is that that causal factors at the biological, psychological, and social level all exist and are relevant to the etiology of mental disorders, and that treatment at mental disorders should be targeted across all these domains as well. That works well enough in practice as a rough guide or as a rough reminder, but philosophically speaking, it is rather inadequate, and for a couple of reasons. One is that it turns the biological, psychological, and social levels of explanations into something more concrete, and that's not really how reality itself is organized. Biological, psychological, and social are human ways of talking about complexity and organization of phenomena, not something that in reality how world is distributed. And the second is it's absent on the question of how is it that they interact. How is it that the biological interacts with the psychological and biological with the social? And how is it that kind of like, what kind of weight should be assigned to different domains when it comes to different mental disorders or different clinical presentations? So in response to these deficiencies, different other kinds of approaches emerged. One common one is explanatory pluralism or methodological pluralism, which instead of dividing, this issue along biological, psychological, social, it refers instead to theoretical methods, and it refers instead to various kinds of scientific approaches we are taking to understanding a phenomena. And it talks about, we focus on the exact method we are using. What are the limitations of that method? What are the advantages and disadvantages of that method? And it recognizes that complex phenomena such as psychopathology are going to require different methods to study it, each offering a certain, advantage or disadvantage. At the same time, the question of how is it that the biological and psychological interact has resulted in kind of philosophical developments in the form of embodied cognition and in activism. So there's this movement in cognitive science, often referred to by the 4E cognition, understanding the mind as embodied, embedded, inactive, and extended. And there's also in neuroscience circles the idea of brain as a predictive processing machine has also emerged, and there are some interesting philosophical connections between these things. So at the moment, in philosophy of psychiatry world, the reliance on biopsychosocial model has been replaced on one side with an emphasis on methodological pluralism and explanatory pluralism, and then on the other side with more sophisticated models of understanding mind-body interaction in the form of embodied cognition and in the form of predictive processing. I want to briefly mention that other questions warrant other kinds of models. Understanding the nature of disorder judgments has traditionally been understood as a question of naturalism versus normativism. To what extent are disorder judgments grounded in objective facts? To what extent they can be described in purely natural terms, and to what extent versus normativism, that is, to what extent disorder judgments are value laden, and to what extent they are referring to human interests, and to what extent they involve social cultural judgments. And then there are hybrid models as well, which include both naturalistic and normative elements. And currently, different forms of hybrid models are influential. Jerome Wakefield's evolutionary approach called harmful dysfunction, for example, is a common one. And there are very interesting and fierce debates between hybrid naturalism and normativism at the moment. When it comes to the question of psychiatric classification, the traditional debate has been between natural kinds, practical kinds, and social kinds. Is that should we understand psychiatric categories as having some kind of hidden biological essence, for example, or should we understand them as more practically oriented categories that kind of carve out and map the domain of psychopathology in ways that are practically useful to us, but not necessarily capture hidden essences. I think again, yeah, depending on the question we're interested in, different positions and models become relevant.
Yeah, yeah. And connected with this, so how do you believe, so since there have been movements to kind of include more patients or service users into this conceptualization of the way that we understand mental disorders, so how do experiences of service users themselves reshape the way that we define mental disorders? And what do you think about including all of these first-hand experiences into all of these committees in kind of describing and defining these mental health conditions?
Yeah, I think appreciating the importance of first person perspectives has been a very particularly important development, over the last 1 to 2 decades. Uh, in terms of thinking philosophically about it, there have been there has been interesting developments in philosophy of science where we have a better understanding of the social dynamics of the scientific method, what is often called the social epistemology of science. That is, what is happening that kind of, in order for science to do its job well, what needs to happen. And one of the common ways of approaching this kind of issue comes from the philosopher of science Helen Longino, who talks about social objectivity of science. Is that in order for scientific communities to function well, there needs to be a diversity of representation of different viewpoints, people coming in with different background assumptions and different experiences, so that Yep. So that people can ask different kinds of questions, and people can interrogate assumptions through different vantage points. And then there needs to be public and fair venues of criticism, and these criticisms need to be taken seriously and integrated by the scientific community in a transformative manner. So within that context of social objectivity, it is now recognized that excluding certain groups from the scientific process comes with certain harms. So traditionally, for example, women and racial minorities were excluded from mainstream Western medicine, and that had detrimental influences. Our understanding, for example, of women's health, women's mental health, kind of was impoverished as a result of that. Similarly, it is now recognized in psychiatric field that excluding the kind of patients with personal experience of mental illness from the scientific process has had detrimental influences, and that it has impoverished our understanding of psychopathology. The social objectivity idea also kind of aligns with what is known as standpoint epistemology. That is, different people occupy different standpoints, and certain standpoints allow us to ask the kind of question that might not occur to other people. So, people who have personal experience of mental illness, they are aware of certain kinds of challenges and certain kinds of issues that researchers who don't have that personal experience are not going to be aware of. So there, it is now recognized that there's a need for scientific community to diversify itself and work productively with individuals with lived experience of mental illness, so that some of the uh, traditional assumptions that have gone by unchallenged can be challenged, and we can think about these issues in a more productive manner. So I think scientific and psychiatric organizations, across the world, have now taken steps to formally incorporate patient voices in the psychiatric research process.
Yeah, yeah. And so coming at all of this from a kind of a more personal point of view, um, have you faced any challenges when arguing that conceptual clarity is as important as biological data? Have you had any challenges in kind of arguing for that?
Yes, I think because I think a lot of physicians don't have the kind of exposure to philosophy or conceptual thinking. There can be a kind of naive reductionism or naive positivism at play, where they have this tendency to think about scientific theories as representing absolute truth, as scientific theories as lacking historical and social context, and they can have kind of like they don't. I'm gonna kind of like restart the sentence. Um, they might not be aware of the ways in which they're confused about psychiatric concepts. So, for example, oftentimes when I work with psychiatric trainees, they might use concepts like medical disorder or mental disorder, or they might talk about mental disorders being brain disorders. And from their perspective, it seems pretty evident to them that what they are saying. But once you engage in some form of Socratic questioning, once you interrogate, what exactly are we talking about when we talk about mental disorders as being brain disorders? What exactly are we talking about when we talk about behavioral phenomena as being disorders? It becomes evident pretty quickly that that they don't have the kind of clarity that is adequate for this purpose. So one of my efforts, on the educational side, has been this project of conceptual competence, in kind of emphasizing to the psychiatric community that just as we expect psychiatrists to be culturally competent, we expect them to be clinically competent, we expect them to be structurally competent in understanding, social structures. We should also expect them to be conceptually competent, that they should have a certain minimum competence in understanding the complexities around psychiatric concepts such as mental disorder, psychopathology, mind body relationship, involvement of values, etc. And so that has been the focus of my educational efforts in recent years.
Yeah, I agree completely. And so when we're talking about this, what are the ways that, aspiring and early career scientists can educate themselves or integrate this conceptual thinking into clinical research or even lab-based research, if you think it's important also for translational scientists as well?
Yes, I think, and the good thing is that at this point we have numerous excellent role models of people who have integrated conceptual and philosophical thinking into empirical scientific work in excellent ways. I think the best example remains the psychiatrist and geneticist Kenneth Kendler. He has done excellent work in trying to understand the genetics of psychiatric problems. He has also done excellent work trying to understand multi-level causality and how to approach issues of classification. And his philosophical thinking was also played important role in the development of DSM-5, with clarification around the issues of external validity and how to think about external validity in the context of psychiatric diagnosis. Other influential thought leaders, such as Steve Hyman, who's a former director of NIMH, he has written about and spoken about how to understand philosophical issues around psychiatric diagnosis. On the neuroscience side, we have examples of figures such as Carl Friston, the person who proposed the predictive processing and active inference model through the free energy principle, and he has demonstrated how engagement with philosophy can be productive for neuroscience. And another example that comes to my mind is the American psychiatrist Do Songer, who is the current editor-in-chief of JAMA Psychiatry. And in his lab, which is devoted to psychosis research, he has engaged productively with questions of philosophy, questions of phenomenology, and his work also exemplifies how engaging with conceptual questions and philosophical questions it's not an impediment. It does not slow things down, but rather it enriches the scientific work that we do.
Yeah. And so when you're mentioning Kenneth Kendler, for example, or Stephen Hyman, and most of these other thinkers, they have done extensively, they have written about psychiatric classifications and have critiqued them in some ways. So do you think that future psychiatric classifications, and now I'm talking about specifically ICD and DSM, do you think that they will change, that they will look radically different given all of these issues that they have? Some of them are, which are evident even from your from this interview that you've mentioned, or do you think they will evolve gradually, or maybe they won't change at all, since from the 80s to this day they haven't changed as much as we kind of maybe hoped even?
It is hard to predict what direction they will take, because there are many factors at play, and these are in the organizations that develop these manuals. The indications at the moment is that they are looking for slow iterative improvement. So they're looking at minor improvements over time, minor changes to diagnostic criteria, minor changes to diagnostic classification that accumulate. But there are exceptions to this. I think the switch from a categorical to a dimensional model of personality disorders, for example, was a big switch. It was made in ICD-11 successfully, and it was partially made in DSM-5 with the alternative model of personality disorders. And in all likelihood, the dimensional model of personality disorder classification is going to become the dominant one. And I think that dimensional thinking is likely going to be manifest in other areas of psychiatric classification as well. So we will see how this happens, but I think in all likelihood we can expect the gradual iterative improvements with increasing influence of dimensional thinking, as well as influences from computational neuroscience and complex dynamic systems perspectives. Another thing I expect would happen is that these manuals can become more transparent about the theoretical assumptions that guide them. I think DSM-3, DSM-4, DSM-5 were relatively silent on the issue of what are the foundational assumptions and what are the foundational kind of philosophical ideas that animate them. And I think that created a lot of confusion, because it allowed the DSM, despite its descriptive nature, to sneak in a kind of neuroreductionism that was harmful. And so I hope that that the DSM and ICD can become more transparent about the philosophical ideas and theoretical assumptions present in them. But I want to point out that within scientific and philosophical circles, the authority and power held by the DSM and ICD have also been diminished, and there have been other influential psychiatric classifications that have been developed and that are getting more and more attention. In particular, HITOP, Hierarchical Taxonomy of Psychopathology, which is a dimensional and hierarchical classification, has become quite influential and prominent in psychological circles. And I'm part of the HITOP consortium. And in fact, right now we are working on a paper which explicitly outlines the theoretical assumptions and philosophical assumptions at play in the framework. The psychodynamic community has produced its own diagnostic manual as well, the Psychodynamic Diagnostic Manual, and different neuroscientific communities are also trying to figure out how to best make sense of issues of psychiatric diagnosis. So one healthy development has been this kind of diagnostic and nosological pluralism, that the scientific community is relying less and less on ICD and DSM, which I think is a good development.
Yeah. And circling back for a moment to neuroreductionism that you mentioned. So, if neuroscience provides ever more biomarkers, how do we ensure that they are conceptually meaningful and not just statistically significant?
I think we have to understand that biomarkers can take many different forms. A biomarker can sometimes be causally informative. So, for example, a spirochete for neurosyphilis is a biomarker that explains the etiology and provides an essence for that construct. Similarly, the genetic mutations for Huntington disease, for Huntington's disorder, for example, but other forms of biomarkers, they may not tell us much about the etiology for a condition. They might, for example, allow us to predict certain things. A biomarker might allow us to predict whether a person is going to respond better to a certain medication or respond better to a certain type of psychotherapy, but it might not be etiologically informative. Other biomarker, for example, may help us stratify patients based on their risk factors, but it may not guide treatment very well, or it may not be predictively very useful in other capacities. So we have to think of specifically regarding what it is that the biomarker is doing and what kind of explanatory power it has. I think there's a naive idea that if we find a biomarker, we have somehow discovered the biological essence of the syndrome. We have biologically validated that in some manner. That is naive and outdated, and I think we have to recognize the complexity that comes with biomarker associations. And we are seeing that in the in the functional neuroimaging world, where, for example, last year there was a major paper in Nature Medicine in which they outlined 6 different biotypes of depression, anxiety, based on fMRI activity, both kind of resting state and based on different kinds of research tasks. And they identified profiles of brain circuit connectivity that had small correlations with either clinical presentation or small correlations with either whether the person would respond better to antidepressant medication or to behavioral therapy. So we are seeing such kind of biomarkers emerge, but we have to understand them in a dimensional kind of manner, and we have to understand that different biomarkers may be better at this or that task without providing us a unified biological explanation for the condition.
Yeah. And so when you mentioned also all of these different approaches, high top, DSM, ICD, phenomenological, approach that is clinical staging. What is your vision, about a psychiatry, let's say, that gets conceptualizing mental disorders correctly? If there is an answer to such a question, and should we behave in a kind of an agnostic way when using these differing perspectives? So should we pick and choose, or should we allow for kind of or hope for an integration of these differing approaches?
What my hope is that we get a better sense of the advantages and strengths of each diagnostic approach, and we are able to utilize them in a manner that improves clinical outcomes and kind of improves the state of patient care. I think it is right that the dominance of DSM is kind of weakening, and clinicians are relying and bringing in other models of thinking too. At the moment, it is happening in a somewhat informal and eclectic fashion, because we don't have systematic research on how to best juggle and integrate these different diagnostic frameworks, in the clinical context. So it's happening in a somewhat haphazard and kind of inconsistent manner. And if hopefully we some kind of systematic research and systematic data emerges that allows us to get a sense of how these different frameworks can be used in coordination with each other, and how we can use them in a manner that improves clinical outcomes. In the current clinical state, I think just becoming aware of the different goals and methods and strengths of these frameworks can be quite useful, and how to use them to create a comprehensive formulation or conceptualization of a person's problem can be quite useful. And there was a paper we published last year with Alan Francis in Journal of Nervous and Mental Disease on the issue of diagnostic pluralism, in particular the question of categorical versus dimensional approaches. How can we use categorical and dimensional approaches productively, together in clinical practice? And I would refer readers to that paper for further discussion of that issue.
Thank you. And finally, if you could give one piece of advice to young researchers about how to think about mental disorders, what would it be?
I would encourage them to be mindful of what assumptions are guiding their understanding of mental disorders, and how they can think about the nature of mental disorders and the etiology of mental disorders, through other lenses and other perspectives. I think the biggest problem right now is that there's a kind of implicit reductionism present in the minds of many psychiatrists and psychiatric researchers that doesn't become obvious until they engage in some form of conceptual thinking or in some form of philosophical collaboration. So I think becoming aware of implicit assumptions is the most important step, because once we make those assumptions explicit, then we can interrogate them, and we can discover what assumptions have been holding us back. In the neuroscience world, in the behavioral neuroscience world, one of the biggest thing that has happened is that instead of a focus on molecular, neuroscience, molecular genetics, people are recognizing that we have to look at these problems through the lens of complex dynamic computational systems. And that only happened once we interrogated what our assumptions about the nature of these problems were. And once those were made explicit, we realized that we need to look at these issues from a systems level, and we have to look at how different components are interacting with each other. And if we look at those components in isolation, without regard for context, we're going to miss out on a lot of what is happening.
Thank you, Awais, both for this interview and for your work in general, and for introducing us and educating us on the richness that is philosophy of psychiatry, and more specifically, conceptualizing different approaches to conceptualizing mental disorders.
Thank you for having me.
Thanks for listening to this podcast from ECNP. The views and opinions expressed in this podcast are those of the interviewee and do not necessarily reflect the official position of ECNP. The content of this podcast should not be used in any way as the basis for treatment decisions.